I really believe as a society, not just within the Christian community, but beyond that we're given a very small window to grieve. And that's actually not how we're wired to grieve. We're wired to grieve for life. It's a lifelong journey. It's not this window of time. I say if you're given 6 months in the UK, that's kind of standard. If you're given 12 months to get over a loss, that's considered generous. But actually, we're robbing people of so much. And so for me, the secret to grieving well is to allow people to sit in that pain. They don't need a cheerleader. They don't need to say, oh, there's a silver lining round the corner.
There's this line in the Bible that says we don't grieve as if we have no hope. In that season, what did the relationship between grief and hope look like? What did it look like to grieve but not completely give up on hope? Another episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. I am Belle Tindall.
And I'm Justin Brierley.
And we, as usual, together with a number of incredible guests, we ponder, are we craving re-enchantment? And can it be found in the wonder and the mystery of the Christian story?
Today's guest is Zoe Clark-Coates MBE. She's a grief specialist. She continues to share her story and wisdom through her 5 best-selling books, her numerous TV and radio appearances, and her very own podcast. And she's the founder of the Mariposa Trust, which you may know by the name of Saying Goodbye. She's the co-chair and co-author of a government review of the reality being faced by those who have lost babies before 24 weeks here in the UK. So we're going to be hearing on Re-Enchanting today Zoe's own story, her incredible work, and her thoughts on grief and hope.
Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm hot today.
We are recording on a hot summer's day.
Which makes me quite thankful that we're not in our usual home, which is a glass box on a roof.
Very grateful that we are in this room rather than there.
It's a beautifully air-conditioned room, I'm glad to say.
It really is.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm so excited to talk to you. I've been so excited about this conversation, and there's so much to go through, but we would be remiss to not ask you our kick-off question, which is, what are you reading at the moment?
Ooh, wow. You see, I get sent so many books asking for endorsements.
Oh,
so
I bet.
I read so many books that I'd probably not pick. And that's good in certain circumstances because I read things that surprise me. And then I read a lot of things that I think, actually, I wouldn't pick that book up. But at the moment, I'm choosing to read Brené Brown and going through her back catalogue because I am such a huge fan of her work and love virtually everything she says.
Yeah, she's got this book. Was it Atlas of the
The
Heart?
Heart, yes.
That big old chunky red one. I literally must flick through that once a day. It's so good. Everything she does is incredible.
It is really amazing. And I just think so insightful and gentle in so many ways, encouraging people just to step outside of their comfort zone. And I love that.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get into, as we said, your story and your work today, but your faith really is the thread that binds a lot of all of that together. Would you mind sort of sharing where that began for you, where you first bumped into God?
Yeah, wow. My parents weren't Christians when I was born, but were brought up in probably a very standard British home where you go to church at Christmas and special occasions, but definitely not leaning into faith from, from the heart, more from a cultural expectation to attend on certain days. And my mum, however, always felt a leaning towards the church and would take herself regularly there as a child. And she got pregnant with me very quickly in their married life. They'd had my sister very quickly and then me quickly after that. And things went really wrong in that pregnancy. She was regularly told that the baby, me, wasn't going to survive, and told also that she'd need to abort to save her own life, and she refused to do that. And the hospital in the end just said, you've got one hope, go to the local church and ask them to pray for you, because there's no chance that this baby's going to survive. So Mom did exactly that. And she went and knocked on her CV church door, and the vicar there was called Father Parker. And she said, the hospital have sent me and said, you need to pray for me. And he did. He laid hands on her and prayed for the baby. And then regularly she would start to bleed. And at that point, the front door, she said, would always knock. And Father Parker was there, and he'd say, God sent me to pray for you. And she'd be like, I've just started to bleed. And he'd lay hands on her again. And then I was born, and the hospital said she's a miracle child. She shouldn't have survived. And then they'd got a name for me, but my dad went to name me and just said, I just know she needs to be called Zoe. And so he chose the name, not knowing any of the symbolism around that it means life and etc.
And he wasn't a Christian at that point?
No, not a Christian.
That's wild.
And it wasn't until I was 5 that they made a formal commitment, and my auntie and uncle led them to Christ. And apparently they were sitting in the living room one afternoon reading the Bible, and I just ran out the room crying and started to then, Mom ran after me, and then she said I started to explain what was said in the Bible passage that she didn't understand, and said I made a commitment there and then. I don't have any recollection of that at all. And so that was the point my faith started, even though I don't remember it.
Wow, that's amazing.
That? Yeah.
My mum always says which makes a lot of sense. So she wrote down the date that I'm one of 5 that all of our siblings became Christians, and next to it, 3 of them, it says Belle forced them.
That's so cute.
And I have no recollection of that.
That's so cute.
But it makes a lot of sense about who I am now.
It's so funny. But it's, so I guess so many people don't know where their story started, but it's always been there. And that's my only memory. But I guess God was chasing after me that whole time, even in the womb, which is quite symbolic, I guess, with the work I now do.
Yes. And that story about your name is crazy, because also in a way that your name kind of defined the story of how you came into the world. But again, like you said, it's defined what you've done since. It's still outworking itself, the fact that your name means life. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and bringing hope to people who have lost life. And I really do feel that was God's hand on my life for such a time as this.
Incredible.
I mean, we introduced you as a grief specialist. Now, there's not many people who can claim that title, but this isn't something you've learned from a distance. It's very much through first-hand experience. Yeah. Would you mind just sort of bringing us through the story of what led you to this particular ministry?
Yeah, well, actually, my mum's a therapist. So I'd grown up with hearing that language and terminology. So when it came to me to choose what to do following on from school education, it felt a natural thing to train in. It was something that was just something I was really comfortable with. We looked at things from the inside out, and we talked about deep issues. We didn't run from things. We faced things head on. So it felt a really natural thing to train in. I absolutely loved it. I did lots of my seconding of my training, where you actually do therapy as my mum seconds. So I got to watch her in action. And that was really special to learn from her as well, firsthand. And I guess I was drawn to helping people through grief, through people I was journeying with as well. I had other areas of real interest as well, but grief kind of picked me through the work I was then doing and helping people. One of my best friends had 2 stillbirths and a miscarriage or 2. And so I journeyed that really closely with her and saw firsthand how grief work really helped people through the darkest times of their life, and how society kind of runs from that sort of pain because it's so overwhelming. And as a nation, we're really bad at death. We're really bad at grief, and we're shielded from it as a child, that we're often not permitted to go to funerals or to see the dying. We're told it's not a place for children, but then we are forced to face it as adults with no back catalogue of references to pull on because we've been kept out of the room. And so for me, that really interested me, why society kind of told us not to look in that direction. And I'm one for very much facing things that if people say, that's not an issue we're interested in, I'm very much the person who's going to be going, why though? Why? Why shouldn't we talk about it? And trying to change a culture around that. And so that's kind of why I went into that area and really believed I understood grief. I understood the technical part of the grieving process. I understood from an educational point of view. And then I went through loss. And then I realized all the training in the world doesn't actually equip you for the journey. Definitely gives you reference points. It probably takes away some of the fear elements of it, but nothing I trained actually prepared me for experiencing it firsthand.
Tell us a bit about what that first-hand experience was, if you're able.
It was a valley time of absolute devastation that we had waited to have children. We were, I trained, as I said, then went into the corporate world, which is probably needed for reference here. So I'd gone into the events, PR, marketing world and still used all of my counselling training very much every day with clients and with friends. But I was loving our corporate life. And so we delayed having children, believing the fact that when we decided to have children, really naively, that it would just happen and everything would be okay. So when that biological clock started ticking, which I always believed was a myth, and it turned out it's not, and you suddenly get this burning desire that I really want to have a child, you kind of want it to happen very quickly then. And we tried for children. We were really blessed to get pregnant quite quickly. Tragically, we lost that first baby and we'd never even told anybody we were expecting. And it felt like a really intimate thing to share, actually. We had waited quite a long time to have children. So people had stopped asking us, are you going to have a child soon? You get to a point in marriage that people stop asking you, thinking, is there a problem? Maybe they just don't want children. And so it felt like a really intimate thing to share. Look, we're on this journey to grow our family. And so we didn't share at all. Our second pregnancy felt really different to that first, and we were going for regular scans. We were watching our baby grow, and we still hadn't told anyone we were expecting. We decided to keep it secret for as long as possible because we wanted to tell everyone at Christmas, which in retrospect feels so bonkers now. But it made sense initially. We lived quite a long way from family, or did then. And so it was really easy to keep the secret. And so we decided not to tell anyone. And then one Friday afternoon, things just felt really different. And we called a clinic. They said they could privately scan me. We went, we saw our daughter kicking away on the screen. Everything was fine. So that gave us reassurance. But within a few days, the bleeding started to really increase, and we were hosting this big event, and it would just felt like the worst timing for things to start going wrong. And so friends kind of came to the rescue and took on this event, and we ended up heading to A&E. And the hospital were really poor in their care. They asked us why we were so upset. Was it because she was an IVF baby and we'd paid for her? Which completely shocked us and really robbed us of that permission and made us feel really irrational, like, oh, you're not meant to be really sad about your baby potentially dying. And so they told us everything appeared fine, that they would book us in for a scan in a week, that there was no reason at all anything was going to be wrong with her. We'd had a scan days before. And so to go home, just chill and just presume everything was okay. I'm the most impatient person in the world, so wasn't going to do that. So we left lots of messages on clinics' answer machines and got a call on the Monday morning from another clinic that said, come straight in, we'll scan you immediately. And it was just before that scan, I decided I needed to tell the family. I just had a real sense that I needed to. And so we phoned my parents and told them, and they were absolutely thrilled and excited and delighted. And we said, we feel like something might be wrong, so we're telling you now, but hopefully everything's going to be okay. Phoned up my sister and brother-in-law, and they told their children before they were setting off for school. And everything felt in that moment like maybe everything is going to be okay. This is the worst way to tell everybody we've been secretly expecting, but everything may be fine. Got to the clinic, the scan started. It was a really modern clinic, so we didn't just have a little screen to look at. It was being projected opposite on the wall. And we saw our daughter instantly on the screen, and we were so relieved because there she was. But then the midwife went really quiet and really silent and didn't start talking. And me and Andy were just looking from her to the wall. And then we noticed she wasn't really moving much. She was moving, but not a lot. And that's when they told us she's died. There's no heartbeat. And so the movement was just the natural movement in the womb and the baby moving, but she wasn't still alive. And it was so hard to believe and to even receive that information, where we just felt that she was going to be okay. What I haven't said is I was in bed one night and I really sensed the Holy Spirit telling me to get out of bed and to do a pregnancy test because I was pregnant. And I was like, absolutely not. I'm no way pregnant. But dutifully did that, got out of bed, did a pregnancy test, and I was pregnant. And so in the back of our heads, we're like, God's told us about this baby. So somehow she's protected in some way. But actually that wasn't the case. And a week later, we went on to deliver her. And it was some of the hardest moments of our lives. It felt really devoid of hope, really terrifying, really scary, and something we couldn't even imagine reliving. But we quickly went on to get pregnant again, and tragically, we lost that third baby. And it was after that I just didn't know if I could do it again. I was very much like, maybe we shouldn't carry on trying. Maybe we're only meant to have heavenly children and not meant to have children here. So we made the decision not to try again. And in that time, our dog then died, who we'd had for 10 plus years. And our house was suddenly so quiet. And that was when we did our drive of madness, and we literally just grabbed stuff out of our house. I said, I can't even be in the house anymore. And we just started driving, and we drove to the top of Scotland, just crying that whole way. Felt like a pilgrimage where we didn't even know where we were going. And we just sobbed hysterically, and I didn't eat, I didn't drink for days. We just drove, and I just cried and cried and cried. And eventually we got somewhere in Scotland, and Andy said, what do you want to do now? Do we get a ferry across and go somewhere? And I was like, no, let's go home. The vet will be calling for us to collect the ashes. And so we did. We turned around and just drove home. And we then decided to go and try and rescue a dog from a shelter. And then my parents arrived back from a mission trip, and I remember standing in the kitchen feeling really giddy and having to sit on the kitchen floor and going, oh, she feels so ill. And going upstairs and thinking, maybe I should do a pregnancy test. But we'd obviously decided not to try for children. And I was pregnant. And that was so terrifying because I hadn't eaten or drunk. We'd been on this whole drive, and I was just like, this is just the worst thing in the world, but also the best news in the whole world. Because it was like the decision had been taken out of our hands, and everything within us wanted to have a child. But we were just so terrified of that journey. But suddenly it felt like we've been given this amazing gift that you're actually pregnant, and you don't have to make that decision. And I know I would have changed my mind anyway, because that's what grief does. It makes you terrified. But the yearning to have a child would have definitely outweighed the fear of losing a child. And that was the first child we got to bring home from the hospital. So that's how we got Esme.
Wow.
There's so much to ask. But I think, as you've shared about your faith and you've shared about your loss as well, and I know that the story continues a little bit after the so you can tell us about that. But just at this point, there's this line in the Bible that, again, like, Christians are not immune to grief or sorrow or death or loss. Like, that's That's never part of it's never part of the promise, never part of the deal. But there's this line that says we don't grieve as if we have no hope. We don't grieve as those without hope. And so just in that moment, in that season when, you know, because the particular loss you're feeling, a loss of a child, and then there's a very specific hope in there. So just, it's a huge question, but in that, right there, what did it look like? What did the relationship between grief and hope look like? What did it look like to grieve, but not completely give up on hope?
I think in the moment, you don't feel anything. I remember screaming on our bathroom floor, begging God to save my child. And it's a very hard concept to get your head around, that God has the power to save your child, but it hasn't or isn't going to. And that's really complex to get your head around. And none of us will ever know why some get saved and some don't, right? But I was acutely aware that God was closer to me than ever before. And I felt like my relationship with God was so intensified in that period. And I was really aware that people around me who then knew, and also knew that I'd been told to get out of bed and do a pregnancy test. So they were like, how do you even come to terms with that? Is that not a God who's playing games with you? Is that not a God waving a carrot and then taking away? But to me, it was never that. Maybe that's why he told me, because he knew I wouldn't interpret it as that. I don't know. But to me, it felt like I'd been handed the most precious gift from God that gave me more time with my child. So if he hadn't told me, I probably wouldn't have found out for weeks I was pregnant. And those precious weeks were weeks of me rejoicing that she was there. There were a conversation I was having with her where I knew she was within. And that was a gift to me. So I never felt God had played with me. I felt he'd given me this precious gift of time. And I remember being so broken and hearing him say, I get it. The worst loss in the world is losing your child. That's why I gave my son. And if anyone can get this, I get this. And I was like, you're the person who knows. So it was beautiful. It was an enriching time. And I remember a specific moment in the car, and we were driving back from Devon to where we live, from my parents' house in Devon, and the song came on, When the Tears Fall by Tim Hughes. And I felt like I'd had a complete heavenly encounter where I felt like I'd been extracted from the car, and I had this intimate conversation with God that was so transformational that I remember within minutes being almost back in the car and going, I wouldn't exchange anything I've been through for that moment.
Wow.
And then half an hour later that passed, and I was like, oh my goodness, I'd do anything to take these losses away and everything. But in that moment, I remember feeling I wouldn't exchange that everything I've just journeyed, because that moment was so unbelievable. And that to me was the true meaning of those words in the Bible. That God is closest to the brokenhearted and to the bereaved. And I really believe I got that. Even though it was a snapshot, it was quick. It was so beautiful that I think that we have a choice to lean in or to lean out in these moments. And I chose to lean in. And I know that's not the same for many people.
I was going to say, I mean, I've heard stories, obviously, of people when tragedy is struck, they sort of pushed God away and said, how on earth could I believe in
and I
God?
totally understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. But also people whom it's almost the opposite. It's like they have to cling to God because, and obviously that feels like it was more that journey that you went on. But it is, as you say, and you spoke so eloquently about it there, this kind of contradiction, of like sometimes the joy and the hope that comes with, oh, I'm pregnant, and then but the terror of like, but this puts me on this path potentially to this grief and pain again. And I think you sort of get that tension as well, though, even in Scripture, when Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn." There's a natural contradiction there. Those two things don't go together, right? How do you navigate that? Is there anything you can draw on to sort of help people who are going through that very same journey of fear, joy, terror, faith, doubt?
Yeah.
What
I think
helps?
you've got to allow yourself to sit in it. I think as Christians, we're often quick to throw these scriptures at the bereaved, and that actually induces shame when they're feeling hopeless and they're feeling devoid of all hope, and they're often feeling distant from God. And I think it's really easy to use these passages to almost criticize and hold people in judgment because they're not grieving as we think they should. Right. And I know as a grief specialist, the only way through it is to sit in it and to be with it. And I really believe as a society, not just within the Christian community, but beyond that we're given a very small window to grieve. And that's actually not how we're wired to grieve. We're wired to grieve for life. It's a lifelong journey. It's not this window of time where I say if you're given 6 months in the UK, that's kind of standard. If you're given 12 months to get over a loss, that's considered generous. But actually, we're robbing people of so much. And so for me, the secret to grieving well is to allow people to sit in that pain. They don't need a cheerleader. They don't need to say, oh, there's a silver lining round the corner. And we're wired to find cliches, I think, in Britain, to find the silver lining. I couldn't even tell you how many people said to me, at least you can get pregnant. Right. As a way of you should feel grateful because so many people are infertile and can't. And you just want to scream. It's not much good me getting pregnant if I can't stay pregnant. Yeah. But I understand totally that that's not coming from a bad place. It's coming from this innate desire to find a silver lining to everything and to push people towards something hopeful rather than allowing them to sit in the valley. But the thing with grief, you have to sit in the valley. And if you don't grieve fully. Yeah. You prolong the valley period because...
Is it if you try to deny it, you actually just suppress it?
Absolutely. Yeah. But also you make people feel guilty. You make people feel like they need to be ashamed of what they're going through. And what that does is makes people grieve in isolation. And I say around child loss a lot that they say it takes a village to raise a child and it takes a village to grieve a child. Right. But it's also the same around any grieving person. Yeah. You need community around you. We're not wired as humans to do this alone. I think that's proven by the nature of grief tears. So tears of grief are different to tears of joy. They have hormones and chemicals in. They are made to be shed. And there's a famous saying that says if you don't allow those tears to fall, your internal organs will weep instead. And that's proven scientifically that there's a knock-on effect on physical health. And so you can suffer with numerous health conditions and problems, and secondary infertility is absolutely huge if people don't grieve fully, that their internal fertility just shuts down and then they end up on a whole fertility journey of having to navigate IVF, etc., if they want to expand their family. And so there's so many different things that God has made us in a certain way to process, but actually the humans around us often stop us from being able to do that. The other thing about tears of grief is they fall slower down the face than other tears. They cling to the face for longer because they're meant to be witnessed. Right. That means we're meant to grieve with others. We're not meant to grieve in isolation.
It's not meant to be hidden away as somehow, and I think sadly in the Christian tradition church, sometimes we've sort of we do try to hurry that, and we say, but surely Christianity is about living in the victory and, and joy and everything. But the Bible says, weep with those who weep. There's obviously a time when that's the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
And as you say, physiologically, it all makes sense as well. Yeah. How do we in that sense kind of allow that to happen? How do we introduce the idea that this isn't something to be embarrassed about? This is important. This is part of what it means to be human.
I think education. I think this conversation. I think work also at a governmental level, changing how we support those who are grieving, I think is vitally important, which is why I'm also a campaigner and work on that side of things, because I think when you need to change things in society, it's often not just a cultural thing. It's also, especially for this subject, it's something that we need to extend to the medical community, to those who are walking alongside the bereaved at the time of death. I think there's so much to be done. But I think from a church and religious point of view, I think these conversations need to be happening in church. I think we need to be brave about opening up those conversations, but we also need to make sure we create the safe space for when we do, that people are then properly supported. It can't be just something we can do one Sunday a year where we do just a grief service and then we expect people to put that pain back in a box for the rest of the year. That we need to create the space and be open to that conversation and allow it to be messy. The fact that we're not going to know all those answers. If I told you how many vicars each month got in touch with me because they're holding services of remembrance and have no clue because the baby was a certain gestation or because the family are in this place, what on earth do I say to bring hope in that situation? And I think there's an understandable desire to shut down subjects when you can't easily resolve it. Where you can't give it a happy answer and make people feel comfortable. It's hard to leave a room going, you feel awful and I can't make you feel better. But actually, that's what you need to do when you're facing the bereaved. You're not trying to give them platitudes. You're trying to say what you're going through right now is a holy experience. It's sacred. And it's okay for us all to feel uncomfortable. And it's okay for me to turn around and say, I don't know why your baby wasn't saved.
I am just popping in to invite you to be a part of our Seen and Unseen community. You can have Seen and Unseen sent straight to your inbox. On Tuesdays, our editors give a weekly roundup of things that have caught their eye in culture, current affairs, trends, all of it. On Fridays, you will have the best of Seen and Unseen articles delivered directly to your inbox. And you will also be first to know about any events that we have coming up. So head to seenandunseen.com to subscribe. Because I think we've chatted to Kate Bowler in a previous season of this, who was absolutely done with the line, everything happens for a reason. She got diagnosed with cancer and then she was like, do not tell me that. And I think there's that as well, particularly from a Christian point of view, is we are so, if we can't give the reason or even say that there is one about suffering, what do we say? What can we say? But the kindness of God in those moments for you was never that he provided you any kind of answer. It was his closeness. Is that right?
Absolutely. And knowing the fact that it wasn't his will, I think, again, there's a cliche, a tradition within the church to fall on everything happens for a reason. And I've had people tell me now with the support work we do, our charity supports over 50,000 people a week. We have over 650,000 hits a month on our website. So people go, that's why it happened. That's why Jesus allowed it to happen, because look at what you're now doing. And so even now they say that to me and I'm like, no, that's not the case. Jesus didn't make my babies die. Death, the loss, illness happened because of the fall. This wasn't his plan. His plan was never, I'm going to call her Zoe. She's going to do this and I'm going to kill 5 of her babies so she goes on to help people. But he gives us a choice whether to use our pain to help others. And I do believe that's a choice. I don't believe that's an expectation even. I think it's an opportunity. The fact that those who encounter certain things are best placed to help people, but it's not a given that you need to. You're not letting God down if you don't.
Yeah.
And he didn't make me go through what I did in order for me to be a better puppet, for him to orchestrate some great work from. But there was a choice there that I was already trained in it. I then did encounter it. And so I am best placed for it because of both having had the training and then the experience. But I don't believe he orchestrated it for that. And I think by having these conversations that are said to so many people, whether they be Christian or not, I think there's a tendency to go down the line of everything happens for a reason, or God picks his toughest soldiers to go through the biggest lessons. You know, I could sit here all day telling you things that are said to people every single day that actually are the things that often drive them away from their faith. That's why they turn away from the church, because, wow, I don't want to worship a God who made me go through this for a bigger purpose. I want my baby. I want my child. I want my husband. I want my sister still here with me. And so I think we just need to stop all the cliches,
Given that is sadly the temptation to sort of try and put a bow on it, try to, make sense of it for the person. And that's just not helpful. What, practically speaking, would you encourage someone who wants to help someone who's in that place, in that grief? What should they do or say without becoming trite or cliche about it?
I think say I don't have the answers, first of all. I think saying the fact that I can't even imagine what you're going through right now. And the same applies even if they've been through something similar. Everyone's journey is so different. Their childhood, their life story, all of these things play a part. So if I've lost a sibling and you've lost a sibling, our journeys and stories are going to be still so very different. They're going to have similar threads that you can pull on, that similarity, but there's still going to be differences. So I think just saying the fact that you can't even imagine what they're going through, giving people permission to keep sharing their story for however long they feel the need is really important. How the brain deals with trauma is by recounting it and sharing it. And eventually the brain goes, okay, that did happen to me. And that's part of my story. And you get better at sharing it and you get more comfortable with sharing it. And we can reassure those people that that's not because the loss is getting less. I heard many, many times, over time, your loss is going to get less. There's no less. Today, there's no less. My children are just as valid, are just important. They are my children now and they will forever be my children. What has got different is my grief muscles got stronger. I got better at carrying the loss. I got better at carrying it. And initially, the loss filled the room that I occupied and I couldn't see anything but the loss. It consumed it. But over time, that loss didn't get less. The room got bigger and my muscles got stronger. And so it's as horrendous today as it was then. But today I can smile when I talk about my children because my grief muscles are strong. I can carry it well. But I also now see the gifts my children brought me. And I'll often say that some people need to live 100 years to leave a mark on the world. My children didn't need to live that long. The 5 children that I have that ran on ahead have left a mark that will be on this world forever. But their lives were so short. And I can recognize the gifts that they brought. Initially, I couldn't see that. I just saw pain and loss and terror and fear that came with the grief because I didn't know until I was going through it how like fear grief is. It's so consuming and so terrifying. You don't want to wake up the next day. I used to go to sleep every night praying to die, every night. And like, I can only get through today by thinking I might die tonight. That's a pretty dark place to live in. But then hope resurfaced, and I thought hope had completely left me. But now I can see hope was always there. It just recognized I didn't need a cheerleader in the darkest time. It needed to stay silent for a time.
Yeah.
Which is why I wrote the quote, grief is relentless, but so is hope, because hope is always there. And it just sits quietly until it's time for it to resurface. And that's kind of what you need to be aware of when journeying with people through grief. They don't need a cheerleader. They don't need to be told tomorrow's going to be better. They need you to sit with them and say, today is really dark. Let's see what tomorrow brings. And that's the gift we can give to any bereaved person.
Yeah, is just our presence.
Our presence and holding space and holding the tissues and reassuring them that it's okay to cry forever.
The other complexity in your story, so you awfully lost 3 babies, had a beautiful daughter, but your journey with loss wasn't done. You went on to lose another 2 and then have another beautiful daughter. So those second 2 losses, you're grieving, you're in the depths of that grief, but having a daughter witness that. And how did that change the way you allowed yourself to grieve?
It was really different. Every one of my losses have been different.
Okay.
And those 2 losses were different because in those first 3 losses, I was not only grieving the children, I was also grieving the possibility that I'd never get to raise an earthly child.
Okay.
That I'd only ever be a mother to a heavenly child, that most people wouldn't ever recognize me as a mother, but I was a mother. And so I was grieving that. After we'd got Esme, I was then grieving with these next 2 losses, not that, because I was a mother to her, but I was grieving her siblings. She wanted a sibling so badly.
Okay. Yeah.
And so every time I looked at her, I was like, I might never be able to give you what you wanted. And it was very different. We couldn't take to our bed and grieve in a very Victorian way.
Do a drive of madness.
A drive of madness. There was no option of that. We had to still have moments of going out to play, of taking her out to play in the park. And this is where my professional training really did help, because I was acutely aware that children are okay with seeing loss and grief. And actually, it's a gift to them. That by not protecting them totally from it, that you're preparing them for the real world and helping them equip them. And so I knew I didn't need to be totally fake around Esme. I could actually say, Mummy and Daddy are grieving at the moment and we're really hurting, but we're going to be okay. And I knew by modelling that it would be a gift to her. I was also aware, however, that you don't want your child to become the adult in that situation, that you also need to make them feel safe. So it's important to have other adults, and my parents were around, my sister was around, where they could take her out and she could just have an absolute blast if we didn't feel that we were in a place to do that. So there was an escape for her, that it wouldn't have been healthy for her to see that 24 hours a day. But that's when my training absolutely came in to its own, I guess, for me personally, in the fact that I knew it was absolutely fine for her to walk into a room and see us crying. That was okay. But it was a really different experience and really, really hard. And made us question whether we should try again after losing Samuel, which was in exactly the same way, where we'd been going for regular scans and Esme was with us on the day, and our friend who the doctor was scanning me, and his face just fell and he just said, Zoe, I don't even know how to tell you it, but he's passed away. And Esme was in the room at the time, And I remember excusing myself and going into the restroom and just screaming and sliding down the wall and going, not again. I literally can't live through this again. And then having to walk back in the room and saying, okay, come on, let's go home now. And our world had just fallen apart all over again. But we survived it. I went into surgery to deliver him that time. I didn't want it to be prolonged like it had been previously. And we didn't know whether we should try again, but we did. And then we told the whole family we were expecting on Christmas Eve, at a Christmas Eve party, that we were expecting again. And no joke, within 30 minutes, I'd started to bleed. And we had that quickly confirmed that I'd miscarried. And so we then had Christmas, New Year, that whole period, grieving while still celebrating Christmas and wanting to give Esme a magical Christmas. But then I carried on getting sicker and sicker in the January, and eventually booked an appointment to see a consultant and found out I was still pregnant and they'd got it wrong. And I was actually expecting twins. And so we went from having grieved that whole Christmas for the baby we'd just lost to finding out we hadn't actually lost that baby and we were expecting 2 babies.
Wow.
And that's something to get your head around. And anyway, during that pregnancy, I got sicker and sicker, and we got told that it was very unlikely we'd end up bringing 2 babies home. And tragically, during that pregnancy, one of the babies did pass away. I ended up having to have 2 surgeries to save my life, where they didn't know if I would survive. And that was another completely challenging time where we had to lean hard into our faith, just looking at Esme constantly, knowing I was expecting, but knowing that I was probably going to die and I wasn't going to see her grow up was horrible. But the doctors did save my life. And that meant our one child's life was also saved. And we got to deliver her and bring her home from the hospital. And that was how we have 2 wonderful earthly children and 5 heavenly children.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. And like you say, it's not like it's a pretty ending, or
No.
it's something you will live with for the rest of your life. And I've often heard other people talk about grief as something that, even when maybe you've kind of built that grief muscle, but suddenly something can happen, a memory, something triggers, and suddenly it all comes out again. And I'm sure there's no kind of sense in which, oh well, I'm done with that now. It's like it's always the possibility of that something will bring it back to the surface.
And I think for many people who are on this grief journey for a lifetime, they'll tell you the things that are probably most triggering are anything that makes you feel really out of control. So having family members suffer with cancer, that was really challenging. Knowing you can't fix it, that brings back a lot of those memories of you don't have the ability to save your children. You don't have the ability to save your parents who now have cancer. That feels too close to home and brings back a lot of those feelings of feeling endlessly out of control, which is very common in pregnancy after loss. In all of those pregnancies, you're not just dealing with a grief journey, and even with the children we got to bring home, those pregnancies were pretty harrowing. Every time you go to the toilet, not knowing whether you're going to see blood, every scan, and when you're going through recurrent loss, you're scanned a lot. I was scanned every 2 weeks. And so every 2 weeks you have that journey to your clinic or hospital and laying on that couch. And even after having Esme and bringing her home, you've got some history now of bringing a baby home from the hospital, but still the majority of your back catalogue in your brain is being told your baby's dead. And so it's very hard to go to one of those scans and think positively. you're constantly preparing for that trapdoor to open and to fall. And I think that's the legacy of somebody who's been through a lot of loss, that you're not as confident as other people that things maybe will all go well. You're naturally probably more inclined to start preparing for disaster mentally because you've been through the worst. You've been told, oh, that's 1 in a million chance of that happening. And then it's happened. And so you don't have that luxury to just believe you'll have the happy ending. You're constantly preparing for disaster. But with that also comes some beautiful gifts as well, that you don't take things for granted anymore. I say now that I feel joy and happiness way more than I did before loss. In the experience of the valley, I didn't believe that was ever possible. I didn't think I'd ever find joy again or happiness again. And I can hand on heart say that I experience more happiness and joy now than I ever did before those 5 losses, because I don't take things for granted. I enjoy things way more than I think most people do. I very rarely say no to amazing experiences and things that are way out of my comfort zone, because I believe we have one life and I'm here to live it. And so I'm constantly wading through things that are completely out of my comfort zone, which makes life at times very uncomfortable, but also extremely rewarding. And I feel like I have lived 5 people's lives because I accept so many opportunities to do things. And so they're the gifts, even though there are those points that you're aware of that will always be sore spots.
I don't want to bring this to a close, Zoe. And we haven't even had time. I knew an hour wouldn't be enough, but we haven't even had time to talk about your work with the Mariposa Trust. But I just want to direct listeners there to saying goodbye for support. Again, we just haven't had time to talk about it, but the certificates of life and loss for babies lost pre-24 weeks was in a huge way down to years of your campaigning. And there's a government report that you've co-authored, and there's so much, and there's so many ways that you are being so generous with what is so personal and so dear to you. And this is just a tiny example of the ways that wisdom sort of just is falling off you. And you're so generous, like I say, with sharing your story and for fighting for other people to grieve. Well, just to grieve and to grieve in the way that their heart needs to. And so just thank you so much for everything that you do and share.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
Well, thank you for sharing with us. And if people want to take it to the next stage, if something you've said has resonated with them, they're feeling, it may not be themselves, it might be a friend or whatever, where would you just direct them if they want to kind of go on this a bit further into the journey?
Well, head to sayinggoodbye.org if you want to find any sort of support if you've lost a baby at any stage of pregnancy, at birth or in early years. But if you're just wanting support for grieving, find my books at any bookshop. They're there to equip people, to train people who want to help those who are grieving, but also as a guide to help people navigate grief with daily support. It's a therapist in your pocket. And so they're there for people, for those who want their baby to be acknowledged and officially recognised. These new government issued certificates are available to anybody, whether you lost your baby 70 years ago or yesterday. You can find information on that by just searching baby loss certificate on the .gov website, and it will lead you through the application process.
We'll make sure there are links to all of the things you've mentioned there from today's show. Thank you so much for being our guest, Zoe. If you want more from Re-Enchanting, as ever, you can find more at seenandunseen.com, where you can also support the show. It helps to bring more conversations on faith, life and love to your audio or video screens.
Indeed.
For now, thank you so much for being with us. Zoe, God bless you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.